Okay, so in this video, we're getting into the big picture of what we're here to actually achieve. So this is autonomics. We're going to explain what that is. Hopefully by the end of this video, you understand why we're getting into this, why it's important, and you're motivated to kind of get started. We got a few more lessons in the introduction just to get you prepared, but this is the one hopefully that's going to let you see the bigger picture of what we're really about. So the word autonomics, we're basically talking about, as we mentioned in the previous video, all of the unconscious processes that happen in your brain. That's the important bit that we want to look at, and the big reason that we want to be doing that is right here. 95% of all of the brain's activity is autonomic. Okay, so it takes place below the conscious level of awareness. That's 95%, which means anytime you're trying to influence your brain by physically doing stuff, that's 5% of your brain that's working. You are going to influence the 95%, but the ratio is much more biased towards the autonomic nervous system having control over what's going on in your body than you consciously having control of what's going on in your body. In fact, you just kind of get left with the dregs of whatever the autonomic nervous system has decided is safe and is good information to pass on to your conscious brain. That's what it's going to do. Okay, so the the quality of both our movements and our thoughts depends greatly on the quality of information processed by our autonomic nervous system. We talked about the fact that your brain is built for movement, and the way that it decides what kind of movements it's going to make is it's going to take in sensory information from all of those receptors that we talked about, whether that's receptors in your muscles or your eyes or your ears or whatever. It's then going to process that, figure out what it means, and then it's going to decide on a movement output. Now, before this lesson, you might have been thinking that deciding on a movement output is the bit that you do. You are the one who decides what kinds of movements you're going to make. But it's not quite like that. Your nervous system as a whole is going to take the information, decide, first of all, how safe is everything, and second of all, how much of the process does it need to get started before it passes the information on to you for you to consciously decide. Okay, and that is the difference between you doing your gym routine feeling really great and you doing your gym routine with anxiety, or you doing your gym routine and somebody lights a firework behind you and you jump and drop all of the equipment. You didn't get any conscious control over that because the brain just decided, not this time, this is too crucial for your survival and we're not going to let you do it. So in the big picture side of things, the autonomic nervous system is by far the most important one to be looking at and making sure that it's happy. And any kind of movements that you do, we'll talk about a little bit later, any movement that you do is going to be influencing the autonomic nervous system. But sometimes we see things deteriorate a little too far, or we end up in a position where we've been in one state for far too long and it becomes really difficult to move into other states, and that affects things like our thoughts and mental health, but it can also affect our movement, and it can mean even if we're doing the right form and the right technique and the right progressions, sometimes we find we can never see any progress in one specific area. That's all going to be down to your autonomic nervous system, because again, it controls 95% of all of the activity going on in the brain. So if it decides it doesn't want you to do anything, then you are not going to do that thing. So that's a little intense to get started, so let's lighten the mood a bit. So we'll give some examples of autonomic function. The first one we mentioned when we talked about the occipital lobe in the last lesson, that your visual system has loads of autonomic processes that happen before you see the visual picture. So you don't see the actual image of what the light looks like when it enters your eyes. You see the photoshopped version of it, essentially. Your brain has altered it and played with it in a way that is better for your survival for you to take. So these are just the three kind of examples, and we'll explain potentially why your brain might have evolved this. So you probably have seen maybe all of these. Number one, we've got the checkerboard pattern here, and it's kind of, you have to lean in to see it, but the A and the B look like they are different shades, but down here I've kind of cropped them out, and you can see that they are the exact same shade. So one of the things your brain does is it doesn't make sense for it to be color accurate when it can tell that there are two different sections of something or two different areas of something. So in this shaded area, the fact that there is contrast between that checkerboard pattern is more important to it than the fact that the two colors are the same. So it wants to make sure that you can still see that there's a big bit of contrast, and that B square belongs to those same group of white squares, and the A square belongs to that same group of gray squares. It doesn't want any ambiguity, because if that turns out to be important, that the B square or the A square turns out to be a living creature that might poison you or something like that, it wants to be able to know the difference. Then we've got the really classic one that you've probably seen since you were a child, the two faces and the candlestick. You'll look at the image. Sometimes you will see two faces looking at each other. Sometimes you will see a candlestick. Everybody should be able to see both of these images. The rate at which it changes is going to be different for everybody. This is another thing where if the brain, when light enters your eyes, the brain goes, all right, let's cycle through all of the history of everything that we've ever seen, and let's figure out what we could be looking at right now. And sometimes the information that comes in is ambiguous. It's, well, this could be a face or it could be a candlestick. And in that circumstance, the brain has to pick one, because it's not useful to say that it's both things at the same time. The likelihood is that it is one or it is the other. The problem is the brain doesn't know which one that it is, so it's going to show you one, and if nothing happens after a while, it's going to make that switch and show you the other one. If one of those things was particularly dangerous to you, the thinking is that when it shows you and presents that one to you, then your anxiety levels are going to shoot right up, and you're going to know exactly how to react. So that's one of the reasons for that. And then finally, we've got this kind of moving illusions. So when we're out in the open air, we rely on our peripheral vision quite a lot to detect when there are different things, or things when the environment changes. Something might move. We're really sensitive to movement in our peripheral vision. Well, when we get a grid like this, where it's really hard to tell where each specific square ends and another one begins, because it's all the same and they're just all layered over each other, the brain finds that really hard to monitor. So what it does is it creates this small images of movement so that your eyes want to dart to each different bit, so that makes it easier for you to keep your eye on the whole picture, because it's not doing a very good job. It's not finding it easy to process that. So those are kind of three basic examples. You can never change these visual illusions. You will always see these illusions exactly like this, and that is because the brain has done the processing below your conscious level of awareness. One more visual example. This is my absolute favorite thing ever about the brain. So we've got this little image of the eye here, okay? So you might already be familiar with how vision works. Light goes into the eye, and it gets refracted, so it kind of bends and bounces off this lens here, and then it's going to hit the back portion of the eye. So the retina is this little yellow sheet here on this picture. That is the bit with the rods and the cones, and they absorb the light and then they create the visual image. Now, there's loads of cool little things about the eye. So obviously one thing that you might be aware of is because the light from the top refracts off the eye, it actually ends up on the bottom, and the light from the bottom ends up on the top. So the first cool thing the brain does is the image that we see is actually upside down, so it has to flip that image to become the right way round. Another cool thing that you might know is this little bit here, the optic nerve. Where the optic nerve is, there is a small portion where you don't have any of this retina that can take in the visual information, which means you have a blind spot in both of your eyes. And again, a little bit like if anyone does use Photoshop, the kind of generative fill that they've created now, where you can Photoshop somebody out of a background and then the AI technology just kind of makes up what it thinks should be there. Well, that's what your eyes have been doing for your entire life. There's two small spots where you cannot see anything, and based on the other visual information that you have, your brain has just figured out, all right, well, you can't see anything, but this is what probably should be there. And because it sits way out in the corner in your peripheral, it doesn't really annoy or bother you unless you end up with problems. However, those are not the coolest parts as far as I'm concerned. The absolute greatest visual illusion from the eyes is, you might have noticed, this retina here is on the outside of the eye compared to these blood vessels. So what that means is the blood supply to the eye sits in front of the sheet of retina, which is taking in the visual image, which means when the light hits your eyes, it's going through the blood vessels, and the brain has to figure out how to remove any discoloration, disambiguation from the blood vessels somehow. It's got to figure out a way to do that. And one of the ways that it does, it makes the eyes do thousands and thousands of tiny, tiny little movements that you cannot see with the naked eye, so that it's like taking multiple pictures from very slightly different angles, and it keeps all of the things that are different each time, because those are the things out in the world, and the things that are the same each time are the parts that are belonging to your eye. Absolutely huge as far as I'm concerned. That's one of the most mind-blowing things I ever learned about the eye, so I thought I would pass that on. But that's just a couple of examples of autonomic function. It's worth knowing. So this is going on in your entire brain. Like you said, 95% of all of this stuff, all of these regions that we talked about in the last lesson, most of it is autonomic. The only other thing that it's worth noting is, when it comes to volitional stuff and the stuff that you're consciously controlling, there's slightly more of that on the stuff that's closer to the front and the stuff that's closer to the top. So the frontal lobe, parietal lobe is going to be more associated with your volitional nervous system. So that's the nervous system where you make the decision and you actually experience what's going on. There is still some of that in the other areas, but as you go further back, so the temporal lobe, there's things like hearing, you are going to sense that. Occipital lobe will be your vision. By the time you get to the cerebellum and the brainstem, which would be sitting kind of deeper in there, a lot more of those processes are going to be happening below your conscious level of awareness. So as it goes closer to the front, closer to the top, you get a little bit more volitional. As it goes further towards the back, it is more unconscious. Okay, so what are we going to do about all this stuff, and why does it matter? So the autonomic nervous system creates reflexive motor actions based on the stimulus provided and the brain's interpretation of that stimulus. So even though you don't really notice it, all the time your brain is just firing a bunch of reflexes through your body, okay? Some examples. Every time I hear something on the right side of my body, there is a sequence of muscle firing, starting with the eyes. The abducens nerve on the eye is going to stimulate the lateral rectus muscle on the eye to make the eyes want to immediately look and see what is over there. Reflexes linked to that eye muscle makes the body want to rotate and look at what is over there. So when you hear just a small noise on one side of your body, there is muscle firing that is priming your body to get ready to rotate and turn. Then they are going to reflexively happen. They're going to be super small, so you're most of the time not going to notice them happening at all. But they are happening. There's countless numbers of these reflexes happening all the time. You know, when you swing one arm out when you walk, when I go into shoulder flexion on that side, there is a reflex that makes the left leg also want to go into flexion, because I walk so often, and that right shoulder flexion and that left hip flexion happens all the time. So your brain saves energy by just saying, all right, well, let's just fire that reflex. And if it turns out that you're not walking at the time, then we'll have another part of your brain switch it off, or we'll just make the firing a little bit weak so that nothing actually happens. So there's loads of reflexes happening all the time. Your autonomic nervous system is taking in, so it's firing those reflexes. At the same time, it is monitoring what is going on in the world based on all of the information that's coming in. It's deciding how much safety you're in and how much danger that you're in. So when it perceives you to be under a higher level of safety, then the reflexes are going to be inhibited or switched off much easier. And when it perceives you to be in much more danger, then the reflexes are going to be stronger, and you're going to have a harder time switching them off. So the classic one is the startle reflex, when somebody comes up and scares you, and you feel your shoulders tense up and you just feel like you had absolutely no control over that. That's the really strong example, but there's going to be lots of other examples all the way up and down your body. That could be important if, let's say, you're a weightlifter and you've got the barbell right over your head, and we talked about this little reflex for the noise that makes your whole body want to rotate. And that's a pretty harmless reflex. If you're under low levels of stress, you can switch it off really easily. You're also not experiencing high levels of load through your spine. Once that heavy weight is above your head, if you hear a noise that is triggering to you, it's very loud, or you're just under an insanely high level of stress overall in general, then you might find that your brain tries harder to act on those reflexes, and maybe that is the reason that you tweak your back with the barbell overhead. It might be because of some random sound or some other visual stimulus or sensory stimulus that had a reflex attached to it, and the conditions were just right that your brain wanted to act to try to move you into safety. When it comes to those reflexes, as the body loses movement function through injury or lack of use, the ability of the autonomic nervous system to influence movement is compromised. So I might have a reflex that makes me want to rotate to my right, but if I'm injured and it actually really hurts me to rotate to my right, then the ability of the autonomic nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system, might fire those muscle contractions and then get more threatening information coming back. And that is going to make it perceive that it's in a higher level of threat. And that can come through injury, can also come through lack of use. So if you're just not so used to moving, when the autonomic nervous system tries to fire out all of its standard kind of reflexes and movements, and the feedback that it gets back is that none of those things happened, well, your autonomic nervous system is going to perceive you to be under more danger, and it's going to hijack more control over your movement. So when you see athletes that are beginners and they just really don't look very graceful, very often it can be because of that. It's because they're trying to move themselves in ways that they're not used to. Their brain is very stressed out by that, and so it starts firing off all these reflexes to not let you go to end range of motion, because that's going to be more dangerous for the joint, not let you rotate as far, not let you move smoothly. It wants you to move quickly and erratically because it's firing a high stress response. So by training movement in the body, and specifically movements valued by the autonomic nervous system, so please note, anytime you're training movement, you are positively influencing the autonomic nervous system. Just doing any kind of movement and exercise is going to be a good thing. We'll talk in the next lesson about threat and when threat levels get too high, but without needing to go into all the details of what we're going to be looking at, just know that you can be influencing the autonomic nervous system just by doing any kind of movement at all, okay? We're going to be interested, though, in specific movements that are more valued by the autonomic nervous system. Those are movements controlled by what we call the cranial nerves. They're a group of nerves that sit in the brainstem. Remember I said in the last lesson, we're going to be really interested in the brainstem and the cerebellum. Those are kind of the two that have the strongest impact on autonomic function, and especially autonomic function that we can influence and control. When we train those movements and we improve our ability to perform those movements, then we reduce the level of threat perceived by the autonomic nervous system, because it knows if it needs to fire off a specific reflex to keep us safe, we're going to be able to do it. If it's worried that we're not actually going to be able to move when we don't move well, and our brain knows that we're not going to be able to move well, threat levels are going to go up. That is going to strongly influence how we move in the things that we want to do. And the benefit of that is we are going to receive more volitional control over our movement. So we should find we look more graceful because we will move in the way that we ask our bodies to move. We will learn things more quickly because we are actually able to pay attention to the movement, and our movements that we're performing are not constantly being hijacked by the brain wanting to pull us in all sorts of different directions. So if we can work out what kinds of autonomic movements, autonomic functions are not working so well in our body, and we can improve those, then all of our other movements are going to improve as well. All of our conscious movements, all of our sports technique and the stuff that we really care about, and it's going to happen at a ratio of 95% to 5%. The impact of improving something like our eye movements when our eye movements aren't working very well can be much more significant than improving the specific elbow position in a tennis serve or something like that. We're looking at the small 1% increase that we can get all the time when it comes to autonomics. We're thinking about the small thing that actually gives a 95% increase in function if we do it right. Okay, so I mentioned something called the cranial nerves, the nerves that live in the brainstem. I just wanted to list them all out here so that you can see what kinds of things we're going to be looking at improving in the course. We're going to be biased towards certain nerves over other nerves and certain types of movements over other types of movements because they're easier for you to do, easier for your clients to do. They're probably easier to understand why they could be helpful, but we are going to have at least a brief look at all of these things because all of them can and will be useful at some point. So we got the olfactory nerve that is going to be dealing with smell. Remember, that can play a big part in emotions and memory are a big part in learning new movements and motivating behavior. Optic nerve, the ocular motor nerve, so numbers 2, 3, 4, and 6. That's the optic, ocular motor, trochlear, and abducens are all around the eyes and vision. So the optic nerve is the vision part specifically. That's the bit that creates the blind spot that's attached to your eye that we saw in the previous slide. Then we got the other three nerves. We have three different nerves involved in moving the eyes, and that is possibly because moving the eyes and vision is so important to us that if one of those nerves was to get damaged, or if one region of the brain, let's say, were to get damaged, we would still have nerves able to move the eyes in specific ways. So they all deal with moving the eyes in specific directions and control specific muscles. We don't need to know that. We just need to know there's three nerves for the eyes, so eye movement is pretty damn important. There's four nerves dealing with vision, so vision is also pretty important. Next up, we got nerve number 5. That is the trigeminal nerve. So it's going to deal with sensation on the face and tongue, as well as movement of the jaw. You might think sensation on the face and tongue and jaw movement isn't going to be such a big deal, but actually jaw movement is going to be a big part of your digestive processes, and that's going to be a big part of how you get fuel. So, and similar with some other nerves as we go further down, there's certain things that we just take for granted because we don't consider them like the intense exercise movements that you might be used to. Then we've got the facial nerve, so it's going to deal with facial movement and taste. So different to tongue sensation, you've got like feeling the texture of your tongue would be in the trigeminal nerve. The actual taste on your tongue would be in the facial nerve. Interesting side note, apparently one of the creators of Ben & Jerry's doesn't have a sense of taste. And so the reason that Ben & Jerry's ice cream has all of these cool textures in it is because that is what he used as a good benchmark for when he was tasting things. And that is because they are sensed from different nerves. So kind of irrelevant, but I thought it was interesting. Facial movement, obviously, that's going to play a huge part in things like social cues, and humans are very social animals, so even if you think that you hate people, there's a very good chance that your social well-being is going to play a big part in things like your posture and your strength and motivation and other autonomic function as well. Then we've got the vestibulocochlear. That's going to be another really important one that we look at. It's going to deal with hearing, it's going to deal with balance, and the big one that everybody's going to care about is it's going to play a really strong role in our posture. So we'll have a whole module specifically on looking at that. Then the glossopharyngeal nerve, it does a little bit of taste on the back of the tongue, also deals with things like swallowing. So most of its purpose is kind of making sure that food goes down the right way. It keeps the airway kind of open and unobstructed, which is going to be super important for things like breathing and talking and digesting food. The vagus nerve, again, one of the big important ones. We say organ function. That includes all of the organs, so all of your breathing, your digestion, hormone release, and detoxification, all of that kind of thing, going to be regulated by the vagus nerve. Super important nerve, the only nerve that if you were to sever it from the brain, it would continue functioning on its own. Then the spinal accessory nerve, that is going to be mostly dealing with your neck muscles, okay, so reason being it needs to keep your head protected, so that's when you go into that startle reflex, you feel the shoulders move up and the neck muscles tense so that it's harder to bash your head around and cause any damage, and that is one of the reasons why just the neck muscles get their own nerve. And then finally hypoglossal, so that's going to deal with tongue movement. Again, it's going to help with swallowing, also going to help with things like speech. So all of those are the things that we really care about. We'll not be looking at it in relation to the cranial nerves. I think that's a little bit too clinical. We're going to divide it into things like vision and smell and balance and hearing. That is, in my view, the more useful way to look at it when it comes to a practical point of view. But just to let you know, this is what it is based on. So those are the things that we're going to want to be looking at training, because they're going to improve our autonomic function. Now we're going to look at how. So number one, you want to assess all of them. So find out, can you actually do all the basic autonomic movements and autonomic assessments, and just get a baseline of where you're at. So that could be just testing, do my eyes move left and right? Can I move my eyes in a circle? Can I balance while my head is moving from side to side? Is my sense of smell equal on one side to the other? All examples of assessing those autonomic movements. The second thing that you're going to want to do, which is what we'll be talking about in the next module, is assess the threat and tolerance of those things. So you might be able to smell equally on one side and the other side, but you might find that the olfactory nerve, the nerve dealing with smell on the right side, is really overwhelmed. So when you cover up your left nostril and you smell, you find that your heart rate goes up and you start to get a little bit of anxiety. And normally in day-to-day functioning, you probably don't notice it, because when you're just out and about and you've got two nerves available, then the right one is just going to switch off and kind of shut down a little bit so that the left one can take over the job. So we want to assess which cranial nerves are working well and our brain is enjoying how they work, and which ones are working but we're really stressed out, and then finally which ones aren't working at all and we just find that we cannot bring a target close to our eyes and have our eyes be able to fixate on that or something like that. After that, then we want to go about improving the autonomic movement. So this is where we're going to be training the movement, and we're going to be focusing on the movement. So let's say, let's take breath holding as an example. If you want to improve autonomic movement fluency, you might be going for a longer breath hold, or you might be going for breath holding while holding an isometric. But the thing that you're concentrating on is, can you do the breath hold during the entire exercise? So whatever kind of thing you're doing, you're focusing on how well am I doing the breath hold. The final stage, all of this autonomic stuff is great, but it exists below our conscious level of awareness. So why should we care about just training and influencing that? We want to be good at the stuff that we want to be good at doing. And at some point, you can train breath holds for as long as you want, but then when you go out into the real world and your brain goes, oh, we're not in training mode anymore, we're in the real world where you normally function and operate, well, you may find that your brain just forgets that it's good at breath holding, or that it's good at eye movements, or good at identifying certain sounds. So then the final stage is you want to integrate with skill-specific movements. So, that could be walking. If you just want to have general healthy bodily function, you might not take it to anything extreme. It could just be when you're sitting at your desk, when you're walking around, or if you're an athlete, you might be doing it in your sport. Can you go for a sprint, but with every type of breathing pattern that your body might throw at you? So when you're going for a run, loads of people say, well, it's better to breathe through your nose, so only run as far as you can breathe through your nose. Well, yes, but also what happens when you're in a competition, you start to hyperventilate because it's too much additional stress, then breathing through your nose is no good anymore. You need to be training yourself to be able to hyperventilate, to be able to do slow breathing, breath holds, to be able to breathe into one lung more than the other, train yourself to deal with every type of scenario that might come at you, and give your autonomic function complete fluency in all the situations that you might find yourself in from day to day. So that is kind of the overview of what that looks like. In the next lesson, we'll be talking about threat and tolerance, and how that will influence your training as well.